Hey people. So in the last tutorial, we talked about how to do some things in the PsychoPy builder. And today I want to talk about how to do some things you can't do in the builder using code components. So this little feature right here. And we talked about in the last tutorial how when you transfer your experimental file from your local PsychoPy to Pavlovia, what Pavlovia is doing is translating your Python code to JavaScript code so that you can run your experiment online. And when you just use the builder, so when you use like this text element or this image element or this keyboard element and most of these things, Pavlovia can translate that code really, really well. But what Pavlovia can't always translate into JavaScript is these code components. So let's have a look at these in a little more detail. So if you want to add one into your routine, you do this, same as with adding text or an image component, and you get this little box here. Notice the tabs along the top. You can add code that initiates at the beginning of the experiment, at the beginning of the routine. And just to remind you, a routine is like one little block down here, like an instructions routine, or I've called this routine bank. This version blocks a routine, choices routine, etc. So your code can initiate at the beginning of a routine. It can initiate at each frame, or it can run during each frame. It might be helpful to put code here if you need something to refresh. If you, for example, have a participant making multiple button presses and you want to load a different image based on the button press, something like that, something that needs to refresh. Or if you're sort of checking the time to see if time has expired, you might want to put code like that in the each frame tab. You can have code that runs at the end of the routine or at the end of the experiment. Okay, so I actually don't need another code component, but here we go. I inserted it. You get the idea, but I'm going to remove this because I don't need it. So let's look at a code component that I have put into this experiment. So this is the Iowa gambling task, and here is a code component I've put in with some code in it, and you can see I've got some code at the beginning of the experiment. Here I have a list of variables and I'm just initializing them. I'm setting some initial value that I want this variable to start at the very beginning of the experiment. If you don't do this at the beginning of the experiment and then you try to sort of use a variable later, you'll get a message saying, you know, that doesn't exist. Another thing to notice here is that on the left side and on the right side, you have two versions of your code. On the left is Python, and on the right is the automatic translation into JavaScript. And this, again, is what I was telling you is pretty well translated into JavaScript, but it isn't always perfect. And let's go over to look at the code that I have on the end routine. And here I just have one thing. I have a variable called block set to 1, and you can see the JavaScript version of that code on the right. So let's play with this a little bit. Let's say I want to write an if statement in Python. So I would say if x is equal to, that double sign or double equal sign means equals to. So if x is equal to y, you need a colon for an if statement in Python. And then let's just say block equals 2. So notice the different equal signs there. The double equal sign is a conditional. It's a yes-no variable, so or it sets up a yes-no logical. So if y is equal to, or pardon me, if x is equal to y, if the answer is yes, then do this thing below it. And in this case, it's set the block equal to 2. So you'll notice that code didn't appear on the right in the JavaScript section until I completed the sentence in Python. And when I get it written correctly, it appears on the right in JavaScript. And notice up here with code type, the default is auto to JS. So that's, it's set to automatically translate my Python code on the left to JavaScript on the right, but you can change that. So I don't want to do it here because I don't want to mess up what I already have in my working experiment, but I'm going to open a new one and, or I'm going to look at one where I already have this written. So let me just delete this. And okay, so we were talking about the automatic translation of Python code into JavaScript code and how Pavlovia does that pretty well for, or very well for text components, keyboard components, stuff like that you do in the builder. It does it pretty well for a lot of what you do in the code component too. The way I showed you how you type some Python code on the left and it automatically translates it on the right if you have it set to that automatic default setting of auto to JS, but it doesn't translate all of that perfectly. So a very helpful person named Wakefield Maurice Carter made a crib sheet to help people translate from PsychoPy, help people translate their PsychoPy code components from Python to JavaScript when the program doesn't do it super well automatically. So here's the crib sheet. You can see it's pretty extensive. So thanks, Wakefield, for doing this. And I'll put a link to it in the comments. And one thing we're going to look at that wasn't just immediately obvious to me what he meant was this part. So Wakefield suggests that you create a code component and name it code.js, and that you put that you set it to JavaScript, so you're writing the code in JavaScript, not in Python, and that you put code like this in it. You don't necessarily need all of these pieces, but you do need whatever pieces are relevant for your experiment. So let me show you what I did in my experiment to make it work. Okay, so back to my experiment, and like Wakefield suggested, I made a code component at the very beginning of my experiment. You can see we're in instructions 1, the first routine. So in the very first routine, I made a code component. I named it JS_code, and let's have a look at it. Okay. So it pulled up with the end experiment tab open, but I'm going to go to the begin experiment tab. And PsychoPy is automatically set to this auto to JS default, but this was actually written in JavaScript. So let me change the code type to JavaScript. And this is the way I wrote it from the beginning. So this code, this comes from Wakefield's crib sheet. And I don't code in JavaScript. I don't really code in Python either, except for what I've done here. But I don't really know how to tell you how to figure out what you need other than just play with it. Look at his crib sheet. You can stick some of it in there, see what works. One way to figure out what you need is just as you're building your experiment, see where the errors come up. For example, I had a perfectly working experiment locally on PsychoPy that used some clock code in Python, and it wouldn't work online. And so I, through a lot of Googling, found that I need that JavaScript, that the translation from Python to JavaScript for this clock code just wasn't working really well, and that I needed this line of code at the very beginning of my experiment to make it work. So I wish I had better advice for you about what you specifically need in this code component, but just play with it. And you can also use the PsychoPy users forum if you have specific questions. But be sure you put this code component in there, set it to JavaScript, and stick some JavaScript code in there at the beginning of your experiment. Okay, so next I'm going to show you some things I've learned to do in code components to make my experiment do some neat stuff. But that's the next tutorial, so I'll see you then. Bye.